Hi everyone, welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today I have Raffi Schieir of Prevented Ocean Plastics with me. Raffi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Raffi is a social entrepreneur and recycled plastic specialist. Founder of Bantam Materials UK, he established the market-leading Prevented Ocean Plastic program, which is changing the future of ocean-bound plastics. Raffi served as chair of Europe's main plastic recycling conference, ICIS 2017, and this year has been nominated in the UK and Europe as Recycling Ambassador of the Year. So many accomplishments, Raffi, in this space, and we know that you really are one of the leading minds and entrepreneurs in this space, so we're really excited to talk to you about this. One of the things that you said to me in the last, in our prep call, and that I just have to start with because it was so impactful to me personally, is that you said that there's $100 billion worth of plastics lying around as garbage, essentially. That's just remarkable.
Well, thank you for starting at that point. I mean, it's a very big one, and it's such a pleasure to be here speaking to you and everybody in the audience about what are some exceptionally important topics. I really believe that when we build a business, we have to build a business that does more good than it does harm. And I really think it's incredibly important for us to take these things into account when we analyze, when we create our forward progress. So when we start with a number like that, that's so substantial, there's a huge business opportunity. There's $100 billion of value that's laying on the ground that has been discarded, that can be picked up and be brought in for a second life and monetized. Now, by monetizing that, there's a business incentive to do so, but it's also creating social support for individuals who are having a hard time feeding their families. They can pick up that plastic, they can turn it in for money, and then they can really engage in that environmental benefit and that social benefit, especially in economies where there's no benefit system in place, where there's no social safety net for people who are in poverty. They can look out into cleaning up their natural environment and turning these materials in and help them feed their families and essentially rise up as micro-entrepreneurs. That $100 billion can be incredibly impactful, not just on that day, but it can be impactful on the stability of that micro-entrepreneurial journey where someone decides to pick up plastic using a sack, and then they decide to get a rickshaw, and then they get a small flatbed truck, and then they put a cage on their flatbed truck, and then all of a sudden they open up their own collection infrastructure, and they've really raised their position in life. So there's $100 billion out there for us to make impact, not just on the environment, but also on the people who are involved in this marketplace.
So tell us a little bit about, well, let's start with a little bit of background. So how did Climeco get to know Prevented Ocean Plastics? And I know that several team members have worked with you, so would love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, we had a really wonderful trip going deep into the supply chain and also looking at solutions. You know, I've had my main contact with Chris Parker. We've been able to really take a look at where the plastic is lying at its worst, where with a little bit of rain, a little bit of wind, it'll end up flying into the ocean if we don't make an impact. And then we were able to get to solution points looking at new build collection centers built in areas that never had them before, and the incredible impact that can be made when infrastructure is built where it's desperately needed.
So tell us then the Prevented Ocean Plastics brand, tell us a little bit about that and how you exist in the marketplace, like what happens after it's been collected.
Well, thank you. So we started for over a decade as a material specialist, a supply chain specialist, and we were doing what was standard business. But in the last 5 years, we opened up our Prevented Ocean Plastic program to do a little bit better. And right now, more than a third of our company's business is doing what we believe is required in the industry, which is knowing where your plastic comes from and knowing where your plastic goes through in multiple steps in the supply chain. So what I mean by that is when we're using new plastic, we're using new plastic that's made out of oil and petrochemicals. You know where it's from, but it's not coming from a good place. Historically, when you've been using plastic made out of recycled plastic, many companies don't really know 2, 3 steps down into the supply chain who's collected it, have they been treated properly, where's the traceability, where is it moved to until it's gotten to their final product. So by us changing our business strategy about 4 years ago to create a vertically integrated strategy, where we started to own and operate collection centers at the infrastructure level, going out into rural communities, building up that infrastructure. And then what we were able to do is then align with the top recyclers in the world in 4 key geographies, 4 different continents, and then get them to work in the same way and share practices, work through distribution, work through program, and then get to branded products on shelf. So then right now, if you go and you buy shorts from Patagonia, if you go buy what is a Louis Vuitton wine bottle made out of recycled plastic, prevented ocean plastic, if you go into Little supermarkets, which is the 3rd largest supermarket chain in Europe, you will always see a prevented ocean plastic logo that will show you exactly where that material has come from. And you know that it's been sourced responsibly, you know that it's moved through to the highest quality and has come out and found a second life, and you can make that clear, better plastic choice. You can say, I will buy something in recycled plastic, I will buy something in prevented ocean plastic, and I know that something's been prevented from going into the ocean.
Wow, that's amazing. And you know that, you've mentioned infrastructure. We all know that recycling infrastructure is a major challenge, and it's been a huge issue in so many, not just plastics, but textiles, for example, garbage, just generally, any type of recycling. And I know that you're working on this huge undertaking called 25 by 2025. Tell us a little bit more about that and the purpose of that.
So this was the decision we made about 4 or 5 years ago, which is we decided to roll up our sleeves and try to get deep down into the collection infrastructure and get deep down into the problem and use it in a strategy which was credibility first, thought leadership, and a positive connection to a real solution. So to do that, the solution to us became really clear. We're now building 25 high-capacity collection centers, plastic collection centers, in 25 coastal regions that desperately need them. We were able to get some big support on that journey. We were able to launch a large collection center, 500 tons per month, supported by USAID. So having the support of the US government in the project that we're doing is fantastic.
Sorry, Raffi, just for spelling out, I always try to spell out acronyms. So USAID, if anyone isn't familiar, is the U.S. Agency for International Development, and that's the development agency of the U.S. government, as you said. Sorry, please continue.
Okay, great. So with that, on this mission to build 25 high-capacity collection centers in 25 coastal regions that really need them, there's big business that's getting involved. There's also USAID that's been involved, and we're really excited because this is allowing people to access this plastic that's all over the place and bring it into an infrastructure that will pay them properly, engage with dignity. There's a concrete floor, there's a roof. People don't need to work in the hot sun. People get to work in a way that just makes sense. And then big brands can know that they can source their materials, the recycled materials, in a way that's both of the highest quality, but also responsible. It's incredibly important. So as we do this, we're on this mission to provide a better plastic choice because so many things are made of plastic. There's an ability for us to do so much social good and economic good for ourselves, which is important. We're a for-profit business, and economic good for the people who touch that material as it goes through the recycling supply chain. It generates impact metrics, and it's real. And telling the truth is so important to us. And if a stat goes into the marketplace, that stat needs to be real, substantiated, used once, and not passed around between multiple groups.
So it's interesting you bring up, corporations wanting, say there is a corporation that wants to incorporate, say we want to have 50% of our all plastic be recycled by X date. So I didn't know, I wasn't aware, you mentioned that there hasn't in the past been a lot of transparency around where that plastic came from or who collected it or how it was managed. So it's really interesting that you're providing this the transparency piece is so important to the market. So very, very interesting. But let's talk a little bit more about corporations. So in general, how are corporations thinking about plastics? Is this important? We see a lot of carbon commitments, some plastic commitments, maybe not as many, but what are you hearing when you talk to corporations about this issue?
So the topic of carbon, the topic of plastic, especially recycled plastic, it goes hand in hand. So recycled plastic is often 1/4, even 1/5 the carbon footprint of using new plastic. So if a company wants to reduce its carbon footprint, it should really be shifting to the best quality recycled plastics that are out there in the market. Now, a lot of corporations are looking at this both in terms of what they have to do, what they want to do, and then risk. So if we break this down into what they have to do, for example, the UK has been a first mover, which is my home market, when it comes to the topic of plastic tax. So the government has imposed a tax when 30% or less of recycled content is coming out into the marketplace in plastic products. Now, we would think that this would work. What we've seen in the initial stages is actually it's not working all that well because the gap in pricing between the plastic tax and the gap between new plastic and recycled plastics is a little bit wider. So the projected amount that was going to be collected by this plastic tax was about 235 million pounds sterling, so more than $250 million. The amount that's actually being collected is closer to 280 million sterling, so well over 300 million US dollars. The reason why that's incredibly relevant is that means that companies have not changed their behavior. Companies have gone backwards, and they're using more virgin plastic because of market factors. New plastic, virgin plastic, has become less expensive significantly than recycled plastic. It has outpaced the tax, and companies have gone backwards based off what they have to do. If we speak about what companies want to do, we've seen some shining stars, and that's really, really interesting. Some companies have made commitments to the way they're going to drive the ethos of their business between now and 2025, 2030, and essentially the way that they operate every day. So amidst the market's move backwards, we've seen a few companies take giant steps forwards in terms of what they're doing, and they've been able to really win customers by choosing to do what they know they have to do no matter what, but they've chosen that they want to do it now. So we spent more than $100,000 on a Kantar research study. Kantar is one of the leading market research groups when it comes to retail behavior of consumers. And that showed that 3/4, about 73% of consumers were seeking brand loyalty, and they were seeking repeat purchases from companies that were taking steps forward when it comes to their plastics policy, and actually when it comes to prevented ocean plastics, that 3/4 were seeking brand loyalty and repeat purchases. Imagine if you're a cosmetics company, how much it means to you to get that brand loyalty. It's very, very, very important. And about 1 in 2 consumers, about 58%, said that they would switch their standard product to one that had a better plastics policy that they understood. And I think that that's a really important stat as well. And I think that what we're seeing here is the ability for companies to communicate clearly, for companies to talk about something like a prevented ocean plastic that's responsibly sourced, doing well, and very importantly, by the way, not more expensive. We operate at scale. We do thousands of tons per month. We couldn't do that if we were charging above market rates. It's very possible to recycle properly and to do it within a pricing context that works for the market. When we do that, and when we do it at scale, we're able to convince the consumer that they'll have this today, they'll have it tomorrow, and we're going to widen the reach of it. It's going to go into more product lines. It's going to be more available to them, and the consumer wants to get behind it. So the companies that have chosen to do this because they want to, because they believe in thought leadership, are doing very well. The third aspect is catastrophic risk. There's a lot of companies out there that that know but don't want to vocalize that there's a catastrophic risk around the corner for them when they realize what the real impact of their carbon footprint or what their plastic policy actually is. When they realize that they don't understand where, in our case, their plastic comes from, and when they go 2-3 steps deep in the supply chain, they're exposed to aspects of child labor, they're exposed to aspects of a supply chain that's not functioning properly for its stakeholders, and they know that that catastrophic risk is around the corner. So what we see here is this balance between these three factors, and the actors that are doing the best are taking this is what we do because we believe in it, and this is thought leadership strategy, and they're being rewarded by winning market share and brand loyalty.
So interesting. That 75% is something you don't see in every survey. I mean, that's a huge percentage, especially with consumers, because a lot of those consumer surveys, people are kind of fickle, or, oh, well, it was 30% or 20%, right? So 75% is pretty massive.
So let's break it down a bit, because I know a lot of your listeners are very educated in these topics. So we conducted a study that was 1,770 respondents across 8 major supermarkets. Sometimes the UK or European disposition towards sustainability can be a little bit of a step ahead globally, which is something that we're very, very happy with. It allows us to make progress. My personal opinion is the American marketplace, when it moves and when it sets in, will move in with more aggression and more speed, because the European marketplace is a little bit more slow paced. It's a first adopter, but the American marketplace, when it moves, will move swiftly and quickly. But going back to the survey, that sample set, which is a very well conducted third-party sample set, came back with 73% respondents that said that they would engage in brand loyalty and they would engage in repeat purchases. And I think that that's something that a lot of companies forget. They focus on their cost structures. They focus on how can we get something at the lowest possible cost, but they're separate and separating their procurement group from their marketing and their sales group. How much would their marketeers be spending in advertising to gain repeat purchasing, a positive disposition towards the brand loyalty? That's a huge spend. So sometimes procurement, sales, and marketing should speak to each other and not just operate independently.
That's such an incredibly insightful context, I think, because a lot of our listeners are they are at those corporations. They are sitting on that side of the table making these decisions. So thank you for sharing that. Another piece you sort of touched on, but we haven't gone super deep on, is legislation. I know, so in the UK, you said that there's been the opposite effect because of market pricing and that kind of thing that was probably not expected. Do you think that other forms of legislation, should they fix that legislation? What do you think would actually help to create the incentive towards circularity? Because really, I mean, I do have to say, we haven't said the word circularity yet, but really, I hope everyone understands this is about circularity, right? This is about moving from, producer puts a lot of stuff in the world, it disappears, to the ocean, right? How do we make that the movement of that product circular and put it back into put it back into circulation, and hopefully have the proper recycling infrastructure so it doesn't make it out to the ocean again. So this is part of this huge puzzle of circularity in plastics. But yes, going back to my question. So will legislation help? Are there other solutions that you see?
Well, let's go deeper on both those points that you made. Super, super, super important. So we'll go deeper into the legislation in a moment. When we speak about circularity, one of the things that I fundamentally believe in, if we want circularity to work, people don't just have to think about what they throw away into their recycling bins, but they actually need to think about what they bring back into their homes. So when we are essentially discarding our plastic, most of the time, less than 10% of what we put in our recycling bins actually ends up being recycled. So we can continue to add to that volume because historically in the recycling market, people talk about a structural undersupply of recycled materials. I would challenge that. And I would say that actually it's a demand issue, not a supply issue. You brought up the $100 billion stat. There's $100 billion of plastics laying on the ground to be collected and brought in if there was demand. We're only using less than 10% of what we put in our recycling bins because of demand. If there was more demand, we'd be using more. So if as consumers we wanted circularity to work and we went into the supermarkets and we made better plastic choices in our day-to-day items, not just in, a Patagonia sweatshirt that's, $80 or whatnot, but when we buy our home cleaning products, when we're buying our fish packs, when we're buying our hamburger trays, that's where the volume is. Now, obviously, go buy that Patagonia item. We work with them. They're fantastic. But it's our daily decisions that are really going to move the needle in terms of the way that we seek out those materials that are in or that packaging that's made out of recycled content. Because I would challenge any consumer to go into the supermarket these days and figure out what's in recycled packaging and what's in virgin plastic made out of petrochemicals and oil. It's a really hard thing to do when you go in the supermarket. So we're trying to make that choice clear for the consumer, and we want that circularity to really work based off of demand. If the consumer starts choosing a Pepsi over a Coke because of recycled content, I guarantee you a Coke would follow suit, a Danone would follow suit, and all of a sudden we'd see a big change in demand. So we need that consumer voice. But let's go back to the question about legislation. Let's go deeper into that legislation. So in the UK, there's a big forward step to have a plastic tax. And the main issue is that it didn't go far enough. So the legislators, when they decided to implement the plastic tax, they didn't realize what the true gap was in a per ton cost between recycled plastics and new plastics. So I'm going to use very, very round numbers. And I'm going to say, let's pretend in a world where new plastic is $1,000 a ton, the plastic tax is essentially $200 a ton. And then recycled plastics, any recycled plastic, a prevented ocean plastic or recycled plastic coming from Germany or the Netherlands or the United States is essentially $1,500 a ton. Because the plastic tax is less than the gap, companies have chosen to pay the tax. And as they've chosen to pay the tax, they're still saving money and they're not contributing to more circularity. Now, the plastic tax has still had a wonderful effect in certain areas, especially in an area of bottling. Historically, when you get a hamburger tray, when you would get a strawberry punnet, where you get these types of products in your supermarket, recycled content was in them. But believe it or not, your bottle products, which are made out of something called preforms, there was very little recycled content. Now, this plastic tax has scared the market and has changed the behavior of the major companies. And the major companies have been going from 0 to 30 to 50 to 100% inclusion because they know it's on the horizon. So the plastic tax hasn't worked in the volume that it's needed to work at in terms of moving the needle in its first few years in its application because it didn't go far enough. Essentially, the plastic tax should bridge the gap between what recycled plastic costs and what new plastic costs. It will then work with incredible effect. But what it has done is has sent an incredibly strong signal to the major players in the market that they need to figure out their recycling supply chains. They need to search out the partners that they can rely on. They need to search out the prevented ocean plastics of this world. And they're now putting a significant amount of products to market, but they're just not doing it in the volume that we would have hoped.
Very, very interesting. We are close to wrapping up. I was going to ask you to if you could tell us a little bit about being recycling ambassador for UK and Europe before we close. I know that's got to be such an interesting role, and we'd love to hear more about that.
So for people who know me on this topic, unfortunately, once I get going, I probably don't stop. I keep talking about it. I find it very, very interesting. Obviously, from an environmental aspect, a social aspect, a fit for business aspect. But the key message is that we all have a role. We all have a role, and it all comes down to better choices. If you're a thought leader in the space, put forward an infrastructure argument, change the behavior within your business, make sure that you're taking the right sustainability policies, get to a point where procurement and sustainability are talking to each other. If you're a thought leader, you can really make change in this industry. You can really show leadership. If you're a consumer, you can go out when you shop and you can create demand. You have a really strong role. Your demand will do a lot. All of a sudden, when companies are starting to inch forward on market share because of sustainability, because of recycled content, because of a prevented ocean plastic, it changes their behavior. Companies are very predictable. And if they can gain market share because of something that's a sustainable initiative, they will do more of it. So if you're a thought leader, you have a role with your choices and your leadership. If you're a consumer, you have a role with your choices and your leadership. If you're a business, you can make that choice. You can choose recycled. Super, super important. And to those guys who are working in government, you got to keep pushing at what you're doing, and you can't be afraid to really do it with teeth. To make industry move, you need to not just send signals, but you need to create a policy that's going to change behavior. Now, everybody has economic interests. Everybody has, different types of, fears at play of how their business will change. But what we know is that we need business and sustainability and recycling to change for the better. What we've seen this year, unfortunately, during the cost of living crisis, is a lot of companies and a lot of businesses have gone 20 years backwards in their supply chains, and they've gone for just what's cheapest without thinking it through. And that comes with catastrophic risk, and they're going to be caught out when they get to 2024 and 2025. So I happen to think that everybody has a role. Consumers, thought leaders, government, we all need to make better choices in what we're doing. And if we made those better choices, we'd be surprised by how much more good can happen than harm.
Thank you, Raffi. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate you coming to share your incredible experience in this space. I'm not sure if there's anyone that has as much depth as you do of having seen so much. And I know you've been to sites all around the world working on this. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
We're here for you anytime you guys want. We created a research center. We have data, we have stats, we have information, we have impact metrics. We'll share it with you. We'll share it with listeners and anybody who wants to take a step forward in the industry. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.